Uh, Good morning, everyone. I'm David Goldstein, Managing Partner at Goldstein Hall, and we're very excited we have an ongoing relationship with ANHD where we provide training and support for not-for-profits and developers who are interested in affordable housing. We're assisting with this training series. This is the first class. And we're very excited to be of assistance here. And, just a little bit about the firm so people know our experience. We've been in the area of affordable housing. The firm has been in existence for celebrating its 15th year. I've been practicing for longer than I like to care to admit sometimes, but 30 years of practicing the area of affordable housing. And we work with not-for-profits and private developers, doing everything from working with them on LIHTC deals, HUD projects, for sale projects. And we have a full staff of attorneys who have great experience. And I'm proud that my co-presenter is our senior counsel, Daryl Austin, who has an unbelievable wealth of knowledge and information in the area of affordable housing. And Daryl, why don't you just want to say a few words?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Daryl Austin. I've been practicing in the LIHTC space, affordable housing world, practicing law since 2002, but I've been in the industry in other capacities for over 20 years now. When I graduated law school, I started representing investors for about 6 years. Went to HUD for about 4.5 years, came back out, worked for the Housing Finance Agency briefly, and I've been with Goldstein Hall for a few years now, exclusively representing borrowers. Don't represent lenders, governmental agencies, or investors anymore. And I just love this side of the table, and I love wearing this hat because you get to influence how the deals are made and how they're put together. And I think wearing all those other hats, the deals came to me, they were already baked already. I'm dealing with stuff that other people put together. So Goldstein Hall, great firm. Love the work that clients are sending to us. And I'm happy to be here to present to you today.
So Daryl, maybe you want to flip up our presentation. And so we're going to try to give you the overview of the history of affordable housing and LIHTC deals in under 2 hours. So we'll do the best we can. We do like interactive presentations. So what we'll do is that when there are natural breaks in the presentation, we'll ask if there are questions, and we'd be glad to try to answer anything that we can.
And just as a quick note, we have this account until about 11:45. So if folks have
faster,
if folks have some time to go over and time to ask questions, that's fine.
Okay, great. So we'll speak like New Yorkers, fast. So this topic is a sort of an intro, and we're going to sort of go through a little bit of history of affordable housing, a little policy, and then go into an overview of low-income housing tax credits and how they work. And just to give you enough of information so that you can sort of go out there and help yourself in your groups. And then, if you check the rest of the ANHD series, we have more in-depth program about LIHTC deals that you're free to sign up for. So Daryl, do you want to start us off with History 101?
Sure. And now that I know that this is being recorded, I should point out that my background cuts out my hair, but I actually have a full head of hair. I want to show that for the record. Let you all know. So housing policy in the United States, as we know it, started back in the 30s. And for illustrative purposes, I like to use the movie It's a Wonderful Life as a reference point. Every December, I watch all the holiday movies, Frosty the Snowman, A Christmas Story, and It's a Wonderful Life is one of the movies that's on my list. Right after the Great Recession of the financial crisis of 2008, I started watching, It's a Wonderful Life around the holidays. And as I'm watching the movie, I'm seeing it in a new light. It is just so historically accurate. So let's go back to 1924. We're going to start in 1924 for purposes of my example, and we're going to imagine that you want to buy a house. So if you want to buy a house in 1924, you would have had to put a down payment of 50% of the cost of the house, and that loan would balloon every 5 years. So every 5 years, you would have to refinance your house. You'd get a new interest rate. Very difficult to build up equity that way. And it's just, very difficult to even come up with the down payment in the first place. And there is a point in It's a Wonderful Life when George Bailey goes to Mr. Potter's office and he confronts Mr. Potter and lets him know, you want people to live in your slums for 30 years while they're saving up for a down payment. Meanwhile, they're wasting their best years, raising their kids, raising their kids. The kids are out of the house, and then finally they've got a down payment to go out and buy a house. And he's saying my Bailey building alone is meant to be different. Is meant to solve that problem and get them into homes quicker. I mean, think about it. Imagine if you want to buy a $500,000 house in the suburbs, and you had to put down a $250,000 down payment just to get in the door. It was just, it was tough. It was tough then. So that's 1924. That's what you would have had to do to get into the house. Now let's fast forward to October of 2029. That's when the stock market crash hits. And the day that the stock market crash hits, George Bailey gets married to his wonderful wife, Mary. They're driving off to the honeymoon, and George Bailey sees that there's a bank run on the Bailey building and loan. So he stops, the car, gets out and goes inside and brings people with him. So it's worth pausing right here to talk about exactly what is a building and loan, savings and loan, what do they do? So, you and I take our money and we deposit it at a bank. The bank will pay us, let's say 5% interest on our deposits. Then the Bailey building and loan or savings and loan would take that money and loan it out to people who want to buy houses. They would charge 7% interest. So they're paying us 5, they're charging homeowners 7, and they keep that 2% difference as their profit. But at any given time, if we all walked into the bank and asked for our money back, they wouldn't have all of the money because they take about 50% of the deposits and then they're out there loaning it. So when the stock market crashed in 1929, everybody walked into the bank saying, give us all our money, all our money. And and George Bailey, is able to talk people, down. So please just take what you need, take what you need. And at the end of the day, let's see if I can make this video presentation work. At the end of the day, this is where they ended up. So George Bailey's very happy right there because the end of the day comes and he still has $2, Mama Dollar and Papa Dollar. So he's still in business. He's not bankrupt. So he's doing well. But what about you? Okay, you bought your house in 1924 with a 5-year balloon payment, and that balloon payment came due in 2029. So the next day you walk into the Bailey building and loan and you say, hey, George, my loan came due. Can you refinance me? And he says, your house is $100,000. I only have Mama Dollar and Papa Dollar. I only have $2 to my name, so I can't refinance you. I don't have the cash. And that right there is the anatomy of a credit crisis. By 1933, 50% of all mortgages in the United States were foreclosed upon. Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes into office, right around that time. And he calls in the bankers from all across the United States, everybody in the Mortgage Bankers Association, puts them in a room, locks them up. 6 months later, they all walk out, and they have created the 30-year fully amortizing fixed mortgage with down payments of only 3.5%. as opposed to 50%. And that's the mortgage that you typically see that people are still using today. They created the Federal Housing Administration in 1934 to administer all the loans. The one thing to note is that all of these rules and underwriting requirements were written by bankers all across the United States. So you'll see you'll see references to, oh, the government supported racially restrictive covenants. The government was against single mothers and widows being able to take out FHA mortgage loans. And yes, that's true, but the rules were all written by the Mortgage Bankers Association. So the politics starts to get a little silly, when the bankers are, you can't trust the government, the government doesn't work. It's like, well, you wrote the rules, guys. So that was the genesis of that. And then over the next 50 years, what you really see is the federal government being sort of a research and development department for housing finance that Wall Street and the private industry would really start to pick up on in the 70s and 80s with all the exotic loan products. In 1937, the public housing was created. And I'm not sure whether this story is just the story that the Democrats said to get the Republicans on board, or whether it was the true intentions. But public housing was meant to be sort of transitional housing where families would live while they were saving up for their 3.5% down payment, so then they could go out and buy an FHA mortgage. But very quickly, public housing then became housing of last resort. As you go on throughout the 1950s, you'll see that the federal government really starts to focus on co-ops. Co-ops just springing up everywhere. My mom lives in Dobbs Ferry. She's in a co-op. I was looking through all of her co-op documents. Like, oh wow, so this was built with a HUD mortgage or an FHA mortgage, all the way back in the day. When you get to 1965, the HUD is created, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and FHA is merged into HUD. So FHA becomes a division of HUD. And people still use that name FHA today, but that's just the historical name. It's all HUD. So don't get confused by that. It's all the same thing. In the 60s, you start to see more rental assistance for renters. You even start to see interest rate buy downs. So if interest rates shoot up to 9%, the federal government is actually buying down the interest rate to 1%. You see landmark legislation of the Fair Housing Act, Civil Rights Act, and that's really what starts to create sort of an insurmountable backlash to the past 40 years of housing finance and development. And by the time you get to 1973, Nixon was stopped all further all new rental assistance that was out there could be renewed, but he wasn't issuing any new rental assistance. And the federal government just continued to pull back, and we're requiring the states to start to take over. And it's interesting because our firm has an HDFC workshop, an HDFC presentation. Rachel Jaffe from our office puts that together. And the first time I watched her presentation, she starts off in the 70s. And I'm thinking, yes, that's historically accurate. Like that's exactly right. Where my presentation stops, that's where hers would start. So yeah, it's the 70s where you really see New York start to take a leading role in providing housing for their own people. And this is a good place where I like to switch it over to David.
Yeah. So one of the, just going through this little history lesson here is that people need to realize that the United States really didn't have a formal housing policy. It was basically, people went ahead, rented apartments, bought homes, but there's no true regulations. And some of the things I always tell people, if you're in New York City, to go to the Tenement Museum to see how immigrants came into the United States and lived on the Lower East Side, there really wasn't any regulation. It wasn't until Jacob Riis basically took his camera and recorded all this, and all of a sudden people were like, well, people are living in slums, families are double, tripled up. This isn't exactly what we want, but there was no real formal housing policy. And, it didn't really all start until the Great Depression and Roosevelt comes into office. And the fear was, well, what's going to happen to the United States? The rest of the world saw what was going on in Russia, and there was real fear of lack of a better term, that the people were going to be an uprising and an overthrow of the government. And so the best way to make people happy, make sure they have jobs and they have homes. And so the United States federal government started to take an active policy under Roosevelt. And so really I always think is interesting, just 1949 was the first real national housing act. And it actually establishes a goal, and this is 1949, a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. It should be a given, but that's really the first time you see the federal government makes that statement. And that actually really starts the advent of what it means to have affordable housing. In New York, even in the 30s, New York was a trendsetter in affordable housing. But New York started in 1955, the Mitchell-Lama Act, which was to create middle-income housing. People thought about low-end housing on the lower end, but New York said, you know what, there's also a need for middle-income housing. So those two acts are really prominent in shaping housing policy. Then you speed ahead, and not much is happening in the world of housing until really in 1986. And the reason this is important is that there was a shift in the country. For those who don't remember, is that in the 80s, Ronald Reagan becomes president, and there's a huge political shift in the country. Republicans' agenda, and I don't mean to, was that the federal government was too big, it needed to be smaller. And one of the agencies in particular that they felt was too big was HUD, Department of Housing and Urban Development. And they saw that as, well, let the states take care of housing as an issue. And so what they did was the housing budget was cut. And what happened was that in the 80s, for those of you who remember, homelessness became a huge problem in the United States. There were markers of daily numbers of 3 to 5 million people in the United States were homeless. It was almost very reminiscent of what we called the Hoovervilles back in the 20s and 30s during the Depression, where people were sleeping in encampments. And what is the best way to get government to act is when they realize, well, there could be potential unrest, and this is bad for cities and government. So in 1986, they said, we need to come up with a new housing policy without really looking like the government is putting money on the table. And so that's when they created the Tax Reform Act in 1986, which creates a low-income housing tax credit. Essentially, it's a federal government housing program, but the federal government is not, in essence, directly funding programs like they did in the days with HUD, where in public housing, where the government basically put the money down on the table and said, here, we're going to build this. What it is, it's by basically a public-private partnership, and Daryl will go in more detail, but the idea was we will get investors to come in and put equity into deals, and that's how we'll create housing. It's an opportunity. It's a tax shelter program. And what they were very clever they did was that in order to make it something that can be palatable to Republicans and conservatives, was that it's run through the IRS. The Internal Revenue Service runs the program, not HUD. So it's kind of an interesting way to build housing is through an agency whose sole purpose is to collect tax revenue. Going ahead, Daryl, let me just go to the Tax Reform Act, the slide, is that, so 1986, what does it say? It says that it's going to provide housing for people earning 50 or 60% of area median income. And the intent is that investors will come into the deal, they'll invest equity. In return, they get a dollar for dollar deduction off their taxes, which is a huge savings. What does that mean, a deduction? Deduction is better than a tax credit because that takes money off the top of income. It's above the line. So that means if I had $100 of income and I got a $1 deduction, I would only have $99 of income, and I'd only be taxed on $99. So if you're a corporation and or a bank and you want to reduce and you have billions of income, and I invest in a tax credit program and I get a $5 million deduction, well, that's great. I'm going to pay less taxes over a period of time. So it's a great incentive. Also, what was passed on is passed on along these deals is the losses. Businesses love losses because they get to take that and deduct that also off their income. So the whole idea is that we said this is really essentially a tax shelter program to shelter income for corporations in order for them to put money into deals in order to let local governments build housing. And the investors get their benefits over a 10-year period, over a yearly period, and they're supposed to exit in 15 years. Now, that's a whole nother seminar we're doing, and we're in litigation about this, suing on behalf of a client, in which investors are now no longer keeping to the deal about exiting 15 years. But that's a whole nother presentation. So essentially, what happens is that in 1986, they create the act. They have to amend the act because they realized in 1989, when the deals start happening, the compliance period is for 15 years. Well, local governments started to say, well, 15 years is not a long time for investment in affordable housing. We want longer period of time. So it was the first time then they said, well, we're going to impose an extended low income restriction that even if the investor's in there for 15 years, the project has to be affordable for an additional 15 years. So that's 30 years. However, it gives local governments the ability, and you'll see this in deals in New York, and also other states, to extend the affordability way out. New York is doing extensions to 60, 80 years. In some states, it's almost 99 years because government doesn't want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in affordable housing and have it become market rate. So that's extremely important part. If we go to the next slide, and this is really what's important for not-for-profits, that in 1990, they went back and said, well, we got to amend the act again because we realized there's no true way. How do we get investors out of deals because it's nonprofits were the leaders in tax credit deals, it wasn't really clear. It seems that the only way to get the investor out was you had to pay them. And you would have to pay them at the end of 50 years, a significant amount of dollars. So what happened was that the Congress amends the act again, and this is known as Section 40, under Section 42 of the IRS Code. And this is what many of you may have heard of the term, the right of first refusal, or the ROFR. And basically, it sets a minimum purchase price to assume you pay $1, the not-for-profit would assume the debt on the project, pay any exit taxes. In essence, they're supposed to be able to take out an investor for $1. This right was also extended to tenants if you were going to form a tenant cooperative, resident manager corporations, which is something that's outside of New York City, and government agencies. But basically, this right is very important for not-for-profits in building affordable housing. And as I said, we have another presentation that goes much more detail. And then we just want to do a little bit of, Daryl alluded to the policy. So for those of you who may remember, what did New York City, in particular the South Bronx, look like in the 70s? I think this is always important to remember. These are actual photos of the South Bronx and in the 1970s. What happened? There was disinvestment in New York City and many urban areas, disinvestment. But the low-income housing tax credit, if we go to the next slide, has been an amazing tool for reinvestment in cities. This is actually the Melrose Common in South Bronx, an area where the city has invested hundreds of millions of dollars into affordable housing. And this project that we highlight here is called El Jardín, which is a joint venture between a not-for-profit and two private developers, in which was really unique, in which we worked on, which was also the first green affordable housing project, which has solar panels in a roof garden. And it shows that affordable housing can be more than just what people imagine as what they see public housing. Affordable housing could be unique. It could provide safe, decent housing, and it could be a trendsetter by providing green buildings. So neighborhoods in the South Bronx, Brooklyn, and Harlem have totally been renovated to become now chic areas where people want to live and create gentrification, which is a whole nother story. But affordable housing has become a major economic development for cities around the country. Daryl, I guess I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So just a brief overview of the tax credit program. It's a housing subsidy program for rental housing. So even though the government isn't actually giving out cash to people, the fact that they're reducing taxes, they look at that as sort of a tax expenditure, they call it. They're bringing in less revenue, however you net it out. So it's a subsidy program. It's created within Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code, and it's administered by the states. The states are responsible for awarding competitive credits, and they're also responsible for compliance and oversight over the extended compliance period, 15-year compliance period, and the 30-year extended use period. What can be financed by tax credits? Both new construction, so from the ground up, as well as rehab buildings that are already there. In some cases, if you meet some anti-churning rules, you can actually get a credit on the acquisition, so the price that you pay for a building, not the land, but the building. You can housing, as long as the tenants meet income and rental restrictions, you can house families, special needs tenants, single room occupancy, elderly. There's multiple other populations out there. It's done in urban, rural, and suburban locations everywhere in the United States. And there's additional tax incentives for projects in high cost or difficult development areas that we'll talk about.
And now, sorry to stop you for a second. I think maybe this is a good point to pause to see if there's any questions. I know we've provided a lot of information and background. If anyone has a question, we could take some questions now.
Anybody have anything they want to ask?
This may be jumping ahead a little bit, but who do you think benefits most from these tax credits?
Oh, so certainly residents. I mean, there's demand in New York City. I mean, and especially in New York City, waiting lists are, you got a 10,000 person waiting list, and we might only be putting on, a developer might only be putting a 60 unit project online. So there's just so much demand, unlimited demand, I want to say, in New York City. Certainly the residents, because they're able to find an affordable place to live, and a lot of these projects are really nice. Not just in New York City, but all around the country, because you have the oversight from the governmental agencies, the actual investors that are putting in the money in the project. They're actually, exercising oversight, and they want to make sure that, their good name is not attached to, a slum or something with cheap construction. Sometimes I'll go upstate and I'll see, what your local, contract, small developer is, doing to rehab projects in the various cities, Albany's, Troy, Syracuse, and essentially they're overpaying for the building so much that the rehab and the construction is just, I mean, it's garbage. I mean, like you're going to hear your neighbors. You're going to know every conversation your neighbor is having. But in order to make the projects work, I mean, they can't put any money into the building. So, I think it's a win-win on multiple sides, certainly. And the way that the program works is that the rental units are limited to 60% of tenants, that are making 60% of the area median income. The IRS is now allowing you to average that out. So you might have some tenants that are making 80% and some tenants that are making 40%, as long as it all averages out to 60%. That works for the IRS now. The investors will put in money for the construction, and then they take dollar for dollar tax credits. on that. So if the, an investor puts in, $4 million, then they might be able to, they'll take back, let's say, $5 million of tax credits, and that's how they make their money. They're also able to take depreciation losses and things like that. Sometimes a little bit of cash will actually shoot out to them as well. And essentially the tax credits are taking over the first 10 years of the project's existence. So you've been able to take most of the tax benefits out, but there's still a recapture risk where if a unit falls out of non-compliant, maybe you had a tenant at 100% of AMI, the IRS could come back and say, something, we're going to disallow tax credits for that year, so we're going to recapture those, we're going to take those back. And that recapture risk goes through year 15. So even though all the credits have been taken in 10, it's not until year 15 where you're out of the woods with the IRS's ability to recapture some of those tax credits. As we mentioned, okay,
Question.
Sure.
So what's the minimum size of the project is allowed to be qualified for tax credit?
And it depends on the qualified allocation plan of each state. The qualified allocation plan is the document that sets forth the rules for what project can be awarded tax credits. And typically, I want to tell you, and also you want to get economies of scale, because if you have only a 10-unit project, there's just not enough units that are contributing to the expenses of that building. If you need a new roof replacement, you only have 8 units that are contributing to the roof replacement. I think you really want to get up to at least 50 units, before you get those economies of scale. So you'll have 50 units that are actually contributing to a roof replacement and things like that. Certainly in the 9% realm, those, anywhere between, 40 to 60 units works really well at the state level. Sometimes you get that unicorn 100 unit project. But it doesn't, this program, no affordable housing program works all that well for really small projects, like less than 10 units. The government's tried that in the late 90s and early 2000s, and the returns have been, there's just not enough units that are contributing to the expenses of the common areas, in a nutshell.
We had a quick question in the chat. So who has oversight? Can you just address that?
That's a good question. So as we talked about the way that the LIHTC program works, and all affordable housing programs work, the city or state agents, New York, there's a city agency as well, and also there's state agency. If they're funding the project, they will put a regulatory agreement, and that means a document that gets recorded that sets out the requirements for the project, such as who the rental amounts for each apartment, the income of the people coming in, and the requirements for renting, and the requirements for the completion of the work and keeping the building safe and decent housing. So there's a regulatory agency that oversees, and then there are yearly compliance requirements. So this is not just a one-time shot. There's a lot of paperwork involved in tax credit deals. So the regulatory agency every year is going to want to make sure that you're in compliance. Also, during the term that the investor is in the project for the 15 years, the investor asks for paperwork to ensure that the project is meeting the regulatory requirements, because no one wants to be in a position where a project doesn't comply with the regulatory requirements, because that could be a default, and that could be potentially harmful for the project. So there's a lot of oversight from city and state agencies who are funding these projects.
That's right, and remember, the whole goal is to get folks of modest means, folks below a certain area median income threshold, into units. And generally, as I said, it's 60% of AMI, which can be averaged. Area median income, which we'll talk about later, is sort of it's the median of incomes that are reported to HUD in your geographic area. I will, do we talk about year 15? Yeah, I mean, we talked about the year 15 compliance period. And basically after year 15, the IRS will not recapture credits. So that is sort of a bright line test for investors. And that's why the investors usually want to stay in until year 15, because they want to make sure that they have the oversight, that somebody's keeping the property managers and the developer honest in who they're leasing units to. That being said, if you're a very strong developer, a very strong sponsor, a lot of investors are now willing to leave in year 11, sometimes right after they've taken their credits and tax benefits. So the market is changing there. And then the way to get the investor out, there's two ways. One, if you're a right of first refusal, if you're a nonprofit, you have this right of first refusal where you can simply assume the debt and pay the investor's exit taxes. And then the investor will exit, which sounds like a good deal. And you'll get on these conferences and everybody will tell you it's a good deal. But you have to look at well, who's the person that's telling you that? Because if the exit taxes are $2 million, that's not a good deal. So the other way to get an investor out is through a purchase option. And a purchase option is buying out the investor for the fair market value of the project. And there's so much debt on these projects that sometimes the fair market value is $1, and the fair market value is less than the exit taxes. So, if you're negotiating these agreements, you want to make sure that you have both the right of first refusal and the purchase option. So that way you can exercise and get your investor out for whatever's the better deal. Now we're going to get into a little bit of the details about how to put together a deal. What are we trying to do? And the first concept, I want to get across to you is that the whole goal here is to minimize the debt on the property. If you take a look down at the bottom of the screen, hopefully you can see my mouse that's swirling. John, can you see my mouse? Okay, great. On a conventional deal, let's say that the rents are going to be $1,000. On an affordable deal, we want to get those rents down to $430. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that by minimizing the debt that we take out. So on a conventional deal, let's say it costs $10 million to build. The affordable deal costs $10 million to build. The conventional deal, you have to take a loan out of 80%. That's just standard loan to value ratio from banks, 80%. So you have $8 million of debt. On an affordable deal, maybe you go out and you get bonds from an agency. Bonds just means it's a government loan at a lower interest rate. A government, because you cost it. So maybe you only have to take out a $4 million loan with tax credits replacing that difference between the $4 million on the affordable deal and the $8 million on the conventional deal. On the affordable deal, there's also incentives for those lenders to give you a lower interest rate. So again, that's reducing your debt payment. If you have less debt, 4 million instead of 8 million, and a lower interest rate, 4.5 versus 6.6% on the conventional, and you're able to stretch that loan out over 30 years instead of 15 years on the conventional deal, then you're going to have lower debt payments. You look down here on the monthly payments. Conventional deal, let's say that the monthly payment would calculate to $47,964. On the affordable deal, because we had better terms, the monthly payment is only $20,767, and that's what allows you to charge $430 rents as opposed to $1,000 rents. Because the way that your budget works for an apartment building is that you look at your rental revenues, and then you subtract all of your expenses, and whatever's left over, that has to be enough to pay the first mortgage loan. In a conventional deal, basically they're saying that you need $1,000 rents because you have so many expenses to pay those and still pay your debt. Rents have to be $1,000. On an affordable deal, because you have less debt, then you are able to charge lesser rents, and that's the name of the game. That's what we're all trying to do here.
Right. And so just to point out is that on an affordable deal, in order to make essentially to get to your, depending on what group your population you're trying to service, considering that it may be people of very limited income, you'll need a city or state subsidy so that you can't pay back a traditional loan. And that's why the tax credits work so well, because equity comes into these deals and it's not a loan. There's a major difference between equity and debt. So equity is money that comes in. It does not have to be repaid like it's not being repaid. A mortgage, like a traditional lender, they will put a lien on the property, and they need to be paid back. So most government debt has generally, they may have interest rates, very bare interest rates, but a lot of time the debt accrues, the payments accrue. So the idea is that it'll become a balloon payment at the end of the mortgage period, so that they have leverage to have you renew with them to extend the life of the project out an additional period of time. No one, depending on who you're financing with. So, so the idea is to have as little actual debt that you have to pay. Regrettably, in deals nowadays, we do have private lenders involved because just there's limited dollars, and those dollars do have to be paid. But most of the other debt in equity on the deal is there so that these projects can work.
And there are 3 types of tax credits. The first 2 are based on your cost to build, whether it's construction or whether it's substantial rehab. And there's a 9% tax credits. By 9%, that means that you're going to get, and there's a 4%. There's a 9% and a 4%. The 9% means theoretically that you should be able to get double the credits on those deals than you would on a 4% deal. Therefore, the 9% credits are extremely competitive. The state issues this document called a qualified allocation plan that lays out the rules of the competition. So it's very hard to get those, and that's why people will look over to these 4% credits. What are the 4% credits? They're not limited. They're essentially unlimited. There's not a fixed amount, so they don't have to be competitive. But what you do need to, where you need to work with the state agency is getting an allocation of the state's bond volume cap, getting the state to issue bonds to do the debt for the project. And when I say bonds, all that is a government loan with a low interest rate. And if the government agrees to give you that, these 4% credits will just follow. So it's not competitive. So that's an attractive opportunity to a lot of folks. How is this competitive 9% tax credit pool determined? The IRS, issues a notice every year, and it allocates a certain price per person throughout the United States. If you take a look at New York's population is 19.45 million. So the IRS says, okay, for every person in New York, we're going to allocate the state $2.8125. Which is a weird number, but that's because in this IRS revenue procedure right here from 2019, there was a 12.5% increase in credits for all transactions that closed between 2018 and 2021. So when you take the $2.50 per person number and you multiply that by 12.5%, that gives you this weird $2.8125 per person. If you go down to the calculation, you'll see that there's, every year, the state of New York is able to allocate $535 million. And this represents foregone revenue to the federal government. Just to buttress what we had said before, that the 2 ways to do affordable housing is that you can either tax the citizens and then give those monies out as grants or loans to the developers, or you can do this, or you could forgo taxes and give people tax breaks. But it's all the nets. When you net it all out, it's the same difference to the federal government. And I even did the calculations here for the entire United States. So you can see that in the United States, if you just did it based on the credit calculation, it would be a $9.31 billion, subsidy that the government is giving out. But there's this thing called the small state minimum. So if you're in Rhode Island or Montana or Wyoming, any of those small, Delaware, any of the small states, it says even though you have a very small population, there's a minimum amount of credits that we're going to give you. When you factor all that in, it's a $953 billion program that the government is foregoing any revenues.
Right, and just to be clear, so people know that the allocation for the federal government goes to New York State. So that goes to HCR, Housing and Community Renewal. They get the allocation. What turns out in New York City, there's a sharing agreement between New York City and New York State, where New York City gets a portion of that allocation. Department of Housing Preservation Development, HPD, gets a set aside a portion of that state allocation to use in New York City. Traditionally, that allocation has been reserved for supportive housing, but it's used for any housing in particular. And so that way that New York City has a certain portion of that state allocation which they can use. So just to be clear, so if you're doing a deal in New York City, and you wanted to do 9%, you would apply to HPD. If you're HCR will fund deals in New York City, but not as much because they're covering the rest of the state. So if you have a deal that's out of the 5 boroughs, you would apply to HCR.
I have quick questions.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, so the USA with small state minimum $953 billion. Is that spread throughout all designated small state or each state?
Well, right. So basically, so if you look at this middle calculation, that was based on just the population of the United States times the credits per person. It would only be 931 billion. But because there's a small state minimum that says even though your population would only support, let's say, 2 million in credits, the lowest that the federal government can give you is 3 million. So when you factor in the minimum amount that you have to give to the small states, the entire amount of the subsidy program for the entire United States is 953 billion.
So is that triggers the investors or the affordable housing investors to exit? Is more attractive to towards more small states because there's more subsidy available, minimum available there already, or is that's not true? I mean, it's not. My question is like, is that small state makes it more attractive for investors to go there, there?
It increases the number of deals that the small state can do. There's a number of other factors that affect whether a bank wants to be there, an investor wants to be there. And we're going to get to that in a couple of slides.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just hang on there. There's a third kind of credit that's called the 4% acquisition credit. If you're trying to claim this credit, you really need to have your lawyer, your tax attorney with you before you acquire the property, because the IRS is really worried about abuse on this one. Because, in their mind, you'll have developers out there just selling the property to itself every year to try to generate an acquisition credit. So the acquisition credit can only be taken on the building because the building is depreciable, land is not depreciable. So if you pay, $1 million for a property, 20% is allocated to land, you're only gonna be able to take the credit on, let's say, 800,000. And then there's these hoops that the IRS wants to make you jump through to prevent abuses. Like, for example, a related party rule. They don't want to see 50% of the ownership on the seller matching 50% of the ownership on the buyer. There's some ways to sort of structure around that to make it more palatable. And there's a 10-year limitation. Again, they don't want you changing the property owner every year. But there are a couple of exceptions. For example, if the property has been subsidized by a federal or state government previously, we'll take that into consideration so that you don't trip up the 10-year rule. And I'm going to go through a basic tax credit calculation here. In some of the subsequent slides, we're going to go through some of these line items, what they mean, how they're calculated, and then I'm going to come back to this slide and see if it makes more sense to show it to you now and show it to you later. And there's 2 terms I want you to think about. Very confusing, very confusing, even for seasoned professionals. There's eligible basis, and then there's qualified basis. So basis is really just your cost. What's the cost to build? That's how they're going to generate, 9% and 4% credits on new construction and rehab. How much did it cost? And when I look at eligible basis, I think of eligible bachelors and eligible bachelorettes. And then when I look at qualified basis, it's basically like how many of those eligible bachelors were qualified marriage materials. So if you sort of think about it like that, that might help you with the lingo at first. So you start out with eligible basis, and that eligible basis, there's a couple of ways to modify that to increase it. There's a couple of ways to expand the number of eligible bachelors that are out there. So let's say that it costs 20 million to build a building. Depending if you're located in a certain area, you might be able to get a 30% increase on that. You know, so you go from 20 million to 26 million. And then there's this thing called the applicable fraction. And that's, you know, well, what percentage of the building is actually rented to low-income individuals? Most of the time we see 100%, which is what we would like to see. But, you know, if you had a building that was 50% market rate and 50% affordable, this applicable fraction here would go down to 50%. So that would cut that in half. So basically, when you do these adjustments for where you're located to see if you get that boost, and the adjustment for how much of your building is affordable, that's where you get to your qualified marriage material number. And that's where you're going to be able to base your tax credit rate off of. So it's a 9% deal. You multiply your qualified bachelor's by the tax credit rate, and that gives you your annual credit amount. Since you're able to take these over 10 years, the actual total amount of the credits awarded to the project is 23.8 million. So then you take that out to a tax credit developer. You say, hey, how much are you going to pay me for $23.8 million in tax credits? And surprisingly, the tax credit investor might come back and say, I'm going to pay you $1.02 for every dollar of tax credit that you give me. And that's because that's just the way that we express the actual consideration that's going to be coming into the project. Not only is the investor getting the tax credits, but they're also getting depreciation, other losses. They might need to be in a certain area because of like certain banking regulations. So that's how you get this price up to $1.02 per credit. But they're not just paying for the credits; they're paying for a whole bunch of things. And at the end of the day, that means that $24.3 million right here, that's how much money is going to go into your project. So basically, you can reduce the amount of debt that you would need to bring into the project based on this 24 million that the investor is putting in. And by reducing the debt, that allows you to reduce the rents that you need to charge your tenants. So this 30% boost, I'll go back up, that was this right here, where we're trying to make an adjustment to the number of eligible bachelors out there. If you're located in one of these two areas, that's how you get the boost. First is a difficult development area, and that is in a zip code. It's based on a zip code where there's a high construction cost relative to the income levels of the people that live there. The second way to do that is a qualified census tract, and that's looking at rental data out there to determine whether there's high poverty rates in a qualified census tract. HUD ultimately makes the determinations of which zip codes are going to be difficult development areas and which census tracts are going to be qualified census tracts. There's a cap at the state level as to how many qualified census tracts you can have, even if you have more eligible than are awarded. But if you're in here, that's where you get to increase this your eligible bachelors by an additional 30%. And that's rich. And a lot of times you need that just to make your deal work. Like it won't pencil out, unless you have that big boost. That's one concept. On the Novogradac website, I want to give you this address right here. And what you would do is you would go to this web address, and then right down here, you would put in the address of your project. And then it's going to show you whether your project is located in a QCT or a DDA. Sometimes the information, they're pretty good about updating this, but when the new QCTs and DDAs are designated in September, it might take them a couple of months to update this. So if you're using it towards the end of the year in the fall or early winter, just keep that in mind. The second way that we're increasing eligible bachelors is through the applicable fraction. And the IRS's concern here is that they want market rate units to be treated the same as affordable units. So let's look at scenario one. In scenario one, and I have a key down here as to how the units are treated, whether they're low income units or whether they're market rate units. This is a mixed income project. It's 50-50 market and affordable. But take a look at this scenario one. Even though the unit count is 50-50, you have 4 market, 4 affordable. The affordable units are smaller than the market rate units. The IRS doesn't like that. So basically they say, okay, for purposes of choosing, eligible bachelors, we're gonna use either the smaller of the unit fraction or the floor space fraction. And here, because the affordable units, even though they're 50% of all units, only make up 35% of the floor space, then basically they're only, that number is going to be 35%. So instead of 100%, which is what we had in our model, you're only going to be counting 35%. So it's going to reduce the credits that you can take. In scenario 2, you've got a situation where, the low-income units, which are these 4 boxes, actually have more floor space than the market rate units. You say, hey, IRS, we know that you are, you're really trying to encourage, affordable units. And in that vein, we went above and beyond, and we made the affordable units larger than the market rate units, even though we're still 50% of the project. And the IRS said, we want to see equal. We want to see everybody just living together. You shouldn't have these big indications that you're treating, one, population differently than the other. So even in that situation, they're not going to look at the floor space fraction. They're going to go with the unit fraction. They take the lesser of the two. So that's important to keep in mind. The 9% credit rate, which we've been using to calculate our tax credits for a long time, up until 2008. This rate floated and it moved, in accordance with interest rates. And Congress, when they were putting the programs together, were worried about over-subsidizing the properties. Interest rates move. We don't want, we don't want the, we don't want to put too much subsidy into these deals. They had a present value target of what of how the credits should be valued. So it floated, and that just became unworkable because it could take 2 to 4 years to get a project from conception to actually fully tenant it up. And in that time, you've got this interest rate moving. So how do you model your numbers? How do you know how much debt to ask for? You don't. And in 2008, the HERA legislation, Congress recognized this and fixed the 4% credit rate. So now there's certainty there. You don't have to worry about that rate floating. You're more certain of what you're going to get. The 4% credit, on the other hand, they continued to float. They didn't fix it for the 4% credit. So we've been having trouble with the 4% credit for a very, very, very long time now. And it's been completely exacerbated over take a look at how it just, you have a blip here, but the trend is generally down. And it's been painful, and it's been painful for the past few years because it's called the 4% fixed rate, but on average, people are getting maybe 3.15%. It's just too low. It's just too challenging to get projects done. So we got a nice treat in the tax bill that passed last October. On Sunday night, I was looking through Twitter. I see Emily Kotick from the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition. It took a couple days to get through the legislation. Said, hey, we got the 4% credit fixed. So as of October, the 4% credit has been fixed. So we're going all the way from down here in the low 3s to a fixed 4. And I can tell you that saved a lot of projects across the country. That is that's a big deal. That's a big deal. Big win for the industry. So people are really, really happy. Let's shoot back to our tax credit budgets. For illustrative purposes, I want to show you the difference between a Pennsylvania project and a New York project, because New York is its own thing. So in Pennsylvania, this is how you would think things would work, right? I took a sample project, which is about 45 minutes to an hour south of Philadelphia. If you take a look at the total development cost right here, total development cost was $12 million. Okay, they took their qualified basis, which is basically your marriage. Remember, your marriage eligible costs, multiplied it by the tax credit rate, and they were able to get $10.9 million of tax credits. Oh, look, what does that do? Your mortgage is only $1.1 million. And this was a veterans project. So basically, you can serve, very low income people, veterans, homeless veterans, folks that have, disabilities and things like that. It's incredible. And if you look at the equity percentage right here, 87.5% of the total development cost was paid with tax credits. That's incredible. Now let's switch down to a New York project. As I mentioned, there's this thing called the qualified allocation plans, which sets the rules for how competitive credits are going to be. And most states have caps on the amount of credits they'll award. And they might say something along the lines of, no matter what your qualified basis, no matter what your qualified bachelor numbers are, we're not awarding a project more than $1.5 million in credits. So you got a cap now. What do you do on that cap? Go down to this equity percentage. So with this number, oh, I got a slash there by mistake, but there's only $14 million in equity on a $36 million project. That's only 39%. So you're only getting 39% of this project funded with tax credit equity. So there's a big difference there. How New York tries to make up for it. New York has just a lot of subsidy. New York actually housing policy is one of the best in the country. Well, they will put a lot of their own dollars into a project at low cost interest rates, like 1%. And that 1% interest rate, you might have to pay it 1 year, you might not have to pay it the other year, pull it afloat. You don't pay back any of the principal, it just stays there. So that's how New York keeps the annual mortgage payment low, so that you can still serve the lowest income tenants. But it's just amazing the difference in treatment between New York, which is saying, okay, well, we're going to cap them and we're only going to put in 40% of equity on this, versus Pennsylvania, which is putting in 87.5%. The one thing to note, again, most states, Pennsylvania doesn't have that much soft debt. If you go all the way, I'm scrolling down here, HPD, HCR, supportive housing, soft loans, Pennsylvania can't put in that kind of money. So they're a lot more reliant on the tax credit dollars than New York is. Another thing that we talk about, sort of like behind the scenes, think about these per unit costs, right? Total development, Pennsylvania was $261,000, $728. In New York, total development costs are $540,066. And it's like, at those kind of prices, like, has anybody ever thought about just buying people houses in the suburbs? I mean, that's expensive. $540,000 for an 800 square foot apartment. $261,000, in rural Pennsylvania, for an 800 square foot apartment. I mean, it's expensive to build housing, and that just shows you how important this program is. The private market can't do it. It's too expensive for the private market. You need these governmental subsidies. So now we're going to go back to go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a lot of information, and why don't we take a break and see if people have questions or thoughts. It may be a good time to do that.
We had somebody put a question into the chat before we began our last section. Do either of you know, is there data for who gets into LIHTC units? So data in terms of the tenancy, I'm assuming?
Yeah, New York has a waiting list, so you have to go out and get on a waiting list. I don't know if they'll show you exactly. Like, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I was going to say that so if I understand the question, it's based on income. So people have to certify and disclose their income. That's confidential information, but all that is being reviewed. So all the information you can get is is how many people have been, how many people are being in apartments, essentially. But you're not going to get the actual names of people. That's confidential, if that's the question.
Yeah, sorry. I think I was coming from I appreciated the history at the beginning of saying how the government has prioritized housing, whether it's public versus private. And since LIHTC is mostly private developers and it's kind of an alternative to public housing, I was just wondering, from my experience as a housing specialist for people who don't have homes, most of my clients are not getting into these LIHTC units, which is why I'm wondering
So let me clarify a couple of things. It's a good question. So affordable housing is a very broad term of art we use in the housing community. And that can mean anything from low-income housing tax credits to shelter programs for homeless people. It could be public housing. It's a broad definition to try to encompass all these programs that fall under it. So within that rubrics of term affordable housing, governments, and depending on what state, locality you're in, has different priorities and different programs they're funding. So, you know, in New York City, it's very important to provide housing for people who are homeless, people with disabilities. So programs get broken up that way, and projects are funded sometimes where you may have 100 units, but they may be servicing different types of populations within that one project. And it says affordable, but you may have certain amount of units are set aside for people with disabilities. Certain amount of units may be set aside for people who are homeless. Some may be working people. We have projects where they may just be set aside for low-income seniors. So it's quite a complex picture, and people trying to service, and public housing is just one aspect of that in comparison to other programs. And I would say is that affordable housing is not just private developers, if that's the impression we're giving you. Not-for-profits have been with the original leaders and trendsetters in affordable housing. In the 1970s, community development corporations were the ones who brought the crisis of housing to the forefront. And the initial housing programs were, especially in the 80s, were all, you know, basically community development corporations were the leaders in that. What has happened over the past 20 years or so, or 20, 30 years, is that private developers have definitely gotten involved in affordable housing, and there's some very big companies that are doing it. And yes, that probably the majority of projects now are being developed by private developers, but they're also joint ventures. So it's a complicated conversation to have, especially over a Zoom chat. But I don't know if that answers your question, Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm wondering, I understand that it's all complicated in New York, especially like one building could have so many different types of subsidies that it's hard to like pick apart, I guess, how our tax budget, like our money is being used. But if so much of like the IRS tax credits are going towards funding LIHTC units, I guess I'm curious if there's a way to see like even just basic like census information, like how many people are living in the units, like what is the ethnicity, what is the age, that kind of information. That's all confidential.
Well, they collect that information. I'm sure that maybe, I don't personally know if that's available on websites, but I'm sure that information is collected and researched. And I'm sure there are think tanks or someplace that can be found. I just don't have that answer. I don't know, Daryl, if you know.
Not specifically. What I can tell you is that, I mean, New York is a very special place, where the demand outstrips supply. Is 10,000 people on a waiting list, and that might even be light. I mean, waiting list might be 100,000 people long. I mean, they're really long, and there's not a whole lot of other places in the United States that you know, have a disparity to that effect. Even I want to bring up San Francisco for a second, because people try to compare, you know, New York to San Francisco and try to say, oh, San Francisco is another high cost area and it's difficult to find housing in San Francisco, just like New York. And I always point out, San Francisco is not just like New York. San Francisco's population is 800,000 people. New York's population is 8 million people. I mean, our problems are, you know, 10 times of what San Francisco has. So New York is just a very difficult market to find housing.
Do we have time? Is there time for, is there one more question out there that folks want to ask? And then I think we should probably keep it moving. We got a hard stop, hard stop at 11:45. So can we have time for one more question? Does anybody else want to ask something?
You were just on a recorded video.
It's okay.
Sorry about that.
Could
Go
you
ahead.
Could you do the eligible bachelor thing again? Because I don't understand it.
Yeah, sure. So I can do it right here. And I'll tell you the purpose of this slide right here. It's the same slide that I showed before, except it's showing you what happens when New York caps the amount that they're going to give you at the end. So if you start out right here, this is basis, this is your cost. This is the cost to build. So these are eligible bachelors. And basically you can increase the number of eligible bachelors based on where the property is located. So if you're located in a qualified census tract or a difficult development area, you get this 30% boost. So now you've increased your eligible bachelors from 20 million to 26 million, right? And your building is going to be 100% affordable. So there's no deduction or offset there. So you end up with, 26.5 million people who are, qualified marriage material. So that's how you get there. And then you take that, you multiply it by the tax rate, which is 9%, which is fixed now. That gives you your annual credit amount of 2.3 million right here. And these credits are awarded this amount for 10 years. So the total amount of credits that are available are 23.8 million. You take this 23.8 million number to your investor and you say, how much are you going to pay me for 23.8 million? You come down here and the investor says, I'll pay you $1.02 because I can not only can I take the credits, I can take depreciation, and I really need to be in that market because I'm taking deposits there. So basically that comes out to this $24.3 million number. That's $23 million that you get to put into to pay for your project, and you don't have to pay it back like you would hard debt. So it really reduces the debt. But then in New York says, sorry, we allocate a little bit differently. The maximum amount that we're going to give you is, a developer is $1.4 million per year, that period. So that limits you to 14.069 million in New York. Then when you multiply that by that credit price, $1.02 the investor's paying you, it's only $14.3 million if they're putting it in the project. But as I mentioned, New York is a special place that just has a ton of grants and soft dollars they can put into the project for you, and they're not really going to make you pay it back.
Right, and just so you understand, this is a lot of information, and you could spend a whole hour talking about this. But the sense, just to get out of this, I think is important when you're thinking about affordable housing, especially under the tax credit program. The eligible basis essentially is what, except for basically the land's not included, but everything. What does it cost to build this building, right? And they need to come up with, for tax purposes, what does that cost? The construction and the everything that goes into that, bricks and mortars to build that building, and that's what you're really looking at. And so they're trying to quantify that number. So there's a way to allocate money. And I think what Daryl's been talking about is that, there's just more deals than there are money, regrettably. And so New York State and all states have to kind of basically figure out, we can't use all our dollars on one deal. That's not the best use of our dollars. So there's just government officials who have experience, try to figure out what is that number that we can use per project, essentially, the max that could be used per project. And remember, a project may not need the max of tax credits, but how much can we use to get the maximum amount of projects and service to greater good in that sense? So I think that's just important, that this is not an arbitrary calculation, and this is not an arbitrary thing. This is something that's been well thought out and analyzed over decades, because the worst thing would be is that all the tax credits are used on one deal, and then you're not servicing, say in New York, you're not servicing deals in Buffalo, you're not servicing deals in Syracuse or in the North Country, because you put everything in one deal. So I wanted to make that clear to people.
And then here, one of the things I want to point out is that the calculations are done on a building by building basis. You could define a project as 4 different buildings, but the IRS is going to run that tax credit calculation on each building. So in this scenario, we're lucky because each of the buildings is located in that qualified census tract or difficult development area that gives you that 30% boost. There are some samples out there where basically the project straddles a line, where there's a building that's not in the boost, but a building that is in the boost. So that's where that becomes important. Down here, you'll see the applicable fraction, what percentage of the building is affordable. They'll look at it on a building by building basis. They're not going to look at the overall project. So you have to do this calculation on each building. That's the purpose of this slide. I want to go back to the gentleman's question before about, so what are the factors? What's going to make a deal look attractive to an investor? What are their considerations? One is the overall just demand and supply for credits. Who needs credits? Who's hot for credits? And how many are out there, how many are available, how many are competitive. Some people have just, their own investors or syndicators they use on every project. So, those deals aren't really open up to the entire market for investors. So then maybe on those, those other deals that are out there, investors are willing to pay more because so many of the credits are already spoken for. The timing of how the money comes into the deal affects pricing because there's time value of money there. So if at the end of the day, the investor says, I'm going to give you $24 million into your deal, if you ask for it all on day one, then it's out of their pocket. They can't generate their return until the project is built and there's tenants living in that building. So that's going to reduce the price that they're going to pay. We had $1.02 before, but if you ask for all of your money on day one, maybe they'd only offer you 95 cents, and that would be less money that would come into the project, all because of the time value of money. So most of these deals, you kind of want to you want to use your debt first, and then use the tax credit equity as you get closer to completion to pay down some of the debt that you've used. There's a demand for losses and appreciation. Look at your tax rates. I got a great slide that's coming up. Whereas, after the election in 2016, people knew that the tax rates were going to be reduced. So if your tax rate is only 21%, the deductions aren't going to be as attractive to you. Now we're in an opposite situation where, tax rates are probably going to go back up to 28% on corporations. So now those deductions are more valuable because you're going to owe, more tax dollars. In that example of tax rates, you also have to look at marginal tax rates. Back in the 60s, the marginal tax rates that, actors and actresses like Ronald Reagan paid were like 90%. And that's what got Ronald Reagan into politics and so adamantly involved in tax policy, because in the 50s and 60s, he was paying 90% as his top marginal tax rate. And if that's, if your next dollar is taxed at 90%, these tax credits are very, 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 very valuable. So that comes in. And then there's something called the Community Reinvestment Act. All banks are subject to regulation by the federal government, and they have to comply, or complying with this Community Reinvestment Act makes them look better for their regulators. And basically it measures how much you investing in areas where you take deposits from individuals. So you're going to see in places like New York, where you have a population of 8 million, banks want to be, they're taking a lot of deposits. New York's going to be a lot more competitive than Peoria, Illinois, or someplace in Iowa, because there just aren't as many banks out there taking deposits from individuals.
So yeah, just before we go, so I think just touch on this is that who are your investors in deals? So when we talk about these low-income housing tax credit deals, on one hand, you have the developer, could be a nonprofit, for-profit, or joint venture between a nonprofit and the for-profit, and they're developing the deal and making sure the deal gets completed and making sure the tenants are in there, it's leased up. And then there's another partner in that deal. It's a partnership. And that deal is that there's somebody who's buying into the project, and they will give the equity in the deal in return for these special benefits, the deductions and all. And normally what we have seen for quite a while now is that generally you'll have major financial institutions such as banks who are buying this, is because they have profits, and deductions are great for that. And also that due to, as Daryl alluded to, the Community Reinvestment Act, it's really important for banks to be able to continue to get benefits for their lending. Their lending rate with the Federal Reserve is based on providing benefits to people in low-income communities. And one of the best ways is to invest in affordable housing to show that they're doing that. And so I think you'll find as a lot of the investors are banks, and those generally how these deals are put together. There, you may hear terminology tax credit syndicator. These are basically companies that aggregate investors, and you'll be dealing with them, and they come in and they have made a deal with several banks or a specific bank, and they'll say, we're really interested in your deal. We want to invest in your deal. So that's just sort of give you sort of that overview of like what those factors. So those factors can be many things, even from like prior relationships where an investor may have done deals with a certain developer over time, and they really like how those projects work, or and certain investors may be interested in just in a specific market, or even a specific funding specific populations. So there are many things that go into these factors.
That's right. And I've got a slide here that shows some of the pricing trends. And that's, I guess, where I was talking about, credit pricing was between $1.06, $1.10 until that election in 2016. And I mean, a month later, the election happened in November. In December, you just saw credit prices drop by like 10 cents. And some people really had a hard time closing their deals because the deal just couldn't absorb that big drop. And it was all the investors anticipating that their tax rate was going to go down to 21%, and that basically the losses just wouldn't be as worth as much to them. So then you see, I mean, like down here, the credit pricing has been pretty stable, some blips here or there, but we just had an election, and, the new president is, pledging to raise those tax rates back up to 28%. So also that's an arbitrage. There's going to be an arbitrage opportunity for anybody who closed deals over the past 4 years, assuming that their tax rate was 21%. Now their tax credit rate is going to be 28, or their tax rate is going to be 28%. The losses are worth more than them. So if their rate of return was, they closed on 4%, once the tax rate is increased, their rate of return jumps up to like 11%. So basically they're gaming the system and making money on arbitrage opportunities. We haven't seen actual credit pricing jump up yet, but I expect that will follow pretty soon.
Yeah. So Daryl, since time is precious and I know we have a hard stop for why don't we jump ahead to, I think in the slides, so that we can take questions. I think let's you could show them the rent income calculator, then maybe we'll talk about qualified action plan at the different agencies.
Sure. Yeah. So this is important. If you want to see, what's the maximum rent that I can charge tenants at my property, here is a link where you can go in and they ask for your county where you're located, your median area. And then they'll even allow you to put in the different income levels, 20%, 40%, 50%, 60%, 70%, 80%, and I'll show you the maximum rents. The one thing to watch out for here is that you still have to reduce these by whatever the utility allowance is. So if the HUD utility allowance is, say, $200 per month, you would then have to reduce these rents that you see here by $200 a month. But I mean, it's a general, it gives you a, general information about, how much the rents are charged under the tax credit program.
Yeah, so just to talk briefly, qualified action plan, or you'll hear the term QAP. One thing in the housing world, it's all about acronyms. And you'll hear people throw things around. They're like, what are they talking about? So always ask, what does that acronym mean? So, how are the tax credits distributed? And what are the priorities of any governmental agency in housing? And that's defined in what these qualified action plans are. So this is a process, and right now in New York City, the city housing agency is going through this right now, is that they will adjust and look at what their priorities are and determine what for the next couple of years do they want, where do they want the money to go? So these qualified action plans are very detailed. And if you go to the next slide, Daryl, so people could see is that we provided you these links, and you can go to the government agency website, and they will provide, this is available, and they'll provide exactly how, if you were looking to put a project together, what are their priorities? And at the end of the day, there's a scoring process, because this is not arbitrary. There's actual, when an application gets submitted to get tax credits, you have to fill out a very detailed application, and there, for 9%, there are certain times of the year in which those applications need to be submitted, and you need to meet the requirements. And there's actual tell you scoring. They'll say, based on certain population, there you may get anywhere from 1 to 10 points. So the whole idea is to get as many points as possible, obviously, make sure your project works, but that's in order to meet the priorities of the government agencies. So I think that's something to, when you're getting involved in housing, is to look at these action plans, look at an application. It will help you through that process. And one of the things we talked about, acronyms, if you go know your funding sources. So, affordable housing in particular is all about what I like to say is partnerships. People coming together. There are many parties coming together. One of the partners in the deal is the government, because the housing doesn't get put together without funding from the federal, state, or city government. So these are just a few of the agencies that you could be dealing with on any deal. And the federal, in particular, Department of Housing Urban Development, HUD, sets a lot of the guidelines. Section 8, which is a rental subsidy program, is funded through HUD. What their senior housing projects called Section 202. There are a whole assortment of funding that will come from the federal government with their own regulations and restrictions. And some of that money will be distributed to the city or state municipality, who then in turns distributes those allocations to the project. So you have requirements that HUD may put on a city or state, which then will turn around and put the obligation on the developer, the nonprofit or private developer, or whoever that developer is, to comply, because somebody has to be ultimately responsible. In New York State, there's a lot of agencies, in particular, Housing Community Renewal, HCR, is the umbrella agency for several housing agencies, as you can see. And in particular, the distinctions to be made is that HCR oversees the 9% allocation that Daryl's been talking about, which is competitive. There is State Housing Finance Agency, which is a bonding agency, which is known as HFA. They administer the 4% tax credit, and they will issue, as Daryl had mentioned earlier, they will issue tax-exempt bonds to coincide with the use of the 4% credits. Within that, there are other state agencies that, such as HHAC or OMH, which are dealing with special needs populations, and they have some of their own funding streams, which when you're doing supportive housing, you would be applying to them, and they have their own applications and programs in which you need to deal with. And I always say, go to these government agency websites. The information's tremendous on there, telling you what they're funding, with the types of projects they funded. You can find out a lot. In New York City in particular, the two main agencies really, and there are a host of more agencies which we did not put here, but the two big ones are Department of Housing Preservation Development, HPD, and New York City Housing Development Corporation, HDC. The distinctions are that the New York HPD is a full service housing agency. They, besides providing financing for issuance of the 9% tax credits, they have their own dollars, which they use from city, getting from the city budget, or for the federal government to provide loan dollars. Also, they're the code enforcement agency of the city. So they're out there doing code enforcement. So they're a full-fledged housing agency. HDC is really a finance agency, and they're set up like HFA, a bonding agency, and they have their own dollars, and they are able to have an allocation of bonds and 4% tax credits, which they will fund deals. And sometimes you'll have, in conjunction with HPD and HDC, they will fund deals together and work very closely together. In essence, HDC is the sister agency to HPD. There are other agencies we didn't mention because they're agencies dealing, such as Division of Homeless Services, DHS, that specifically deal with homelessness. But we were trying to give you an overview of housing agencies for permanent affordable housing. I don't know, Daryl, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, I'm starting to see money being funneled through either HFA or HPD, like Office of Mental Health right there. They're now, instead of, doing direct loans to projects, basically what they're doing is they're giving the money to HPD, and then HPD just adds that money to a loan that they're already making. And it's the same thing at the state level for the Housing Finance Agency. On all these deals, I mean, you're going to have multiple sources of funds, just like in the earlier slide where I think you saw about 5 different sources of funds for New York, and I mean substantial sources of funds, as opposed to the Pennsylvania example, or just tax credits and then a couple other small loans. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work cobbling together your various sources. And they all have applications too. So you have to go to their website and be cognizant of when their applications are due. Like OMH, OPWDD, they only got 1 round a year, and if you miss it, then you have to wait until the next year.
So yeah, so I think the takeaway for everyone here is that affordable housing is a great has been a great economic driver, and also obviously providing essential services to people, providing housing and funding services. There are many partners in these deals, and it's quite regrettably complex to cobble all this together. But you should never be afraid to be involved in the process. Maybe we could open it up for final questions, since I know we
have very limited time for 1 or 2 questions, and then
Okay.
I'm gonna close this out.
Okay, great. Thanks, John.
Does anybody have some final questions for David or Daryl?
I'm sorry, because I feel like I'm asking a lot of questions.
Fine.
So my question is actually less about the presentation and more about the rest of the series. Are they all going to be taught by Daryl and David, or we have different presenters for each presentation? And do you have a whole schedule for that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So next, I'm gonna thank you, Bianca, for setting me up for my shameless plug for a future workshop. So next week we're gonna do on Wednesday, May 5th, we're doing Joint Ventures 101. So that's sort of like, as David was alluding to, like sort of the bringing together of various sort of public-private partnerships and not-for-profit agencies and other funding agencies to sort of create and really synthesize these deals. And then that's actually, we're gonna level up the next day on Thursday to do a 201 training. So I think getting sort of more in depth to that subject.
Yes.
And the way the presenters were explained to me, I think it will either be folks from Goldstein Hall or folks that they are affiliated with. David, is that accurate?
That is correct. So there are different attorneys in the office will be on the panels. A couple of the panels we will have, such as we'll have a tax credit syndicator or potentially someone from a government agency to provide insight beyond beyond our beyond us. So you won't be seeing me again. I believe Daryl. I'm not sure if Daryl's on any more panels. So you know, so there'll be other people who will be sharing information.
Great. Okay. And just some quick notes from my end. So I just put my email in the chat for everybody, but you should have it because I did send everybody the link to today, you know, the Zoom link for today's workshop. What I'm going to send everybody when we conclude are the link to the recording. And then I'm gonna, there was a couple of websites that we covered today. There was a census tract website and then a rent income calculator website. So I'm gonna, David and Daryl, I'm gonna grab those links from you, I think over email,
Sure.
and I'll send them out to everybody. And then finally, I'm gonna send a just a very quick short survey for today's workshop of sort of how you found things and then what we can be doing in the future to sort of improve or offer things that you would really like to learn about or something burning that you don't see on the training roster. Does that cool with everybody? Sound good?
Great.
And then would it be possible, we also got somebody in the chat, would it be possible also, David and Daryl, to send the slides from the presentation?
Sure.
Absolutely.
Great. Yes, and then I will be, so as the training coordinator for HI, I'm gonna be hosting I'm gonna be hosting all of these presentations, but then the actual presenters on the subject matter will probably be different and sort of run the gamut. And
Right.
so if you need to get in touch with me for any reason, if there's information missing or just something you want to ask, again, please hit me up over email. But I really just want to take a moment to thank both David and Daryl for being on with us today. Thank you all for joining. Yeah, we hope to see you all at future trainings.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
ANHD does great work. We really appreciate what you're doing for everybody. So keep it
Awesome.
up.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for being
Thank
with
you.
us today.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jeff.
everyone.
Right.